You cannot move forward into greater success. And you absolutely can't lead forward into greater success, greater vision, greater impact, greater transformation. You can't move forward that way unless you're absolutely willing to risk breaking the mold. That there are so many at every level, personal, business, ministry, that God is giving greater desire. He's giving them greater vision. So what's the holdup? What's the great limitation? And that's relying on the way it's been done in the past. That so often the thing that was successful in the past is the thing that's creating the hindrance to greater success. So we are going to do just a very brief overview of understanding paradigms and how to recognize some areas where those paradigms become our comfort zone, but they also can be the thing that brings the greatest limitation to our life, our business, our ministry. So let's look at a few ways to recognize those potential limitations. Recognize that paradigms, the longer we've done something a certain way, the more established that paradigm becomes. And it becomes our comfort zone. Not necessarily because we like it, because we maybe think it's the best way to do it, but the more established it is, the more subconsciously it does become our comfort zone. And why it becomes so much more difficult, why we need to recognize it to break out of that pattern. So just a few little areas to recognize. First off is recognize that paradigms, especially the more established they are, that they're actually a bit flexible. Think of like a silicone mold, that when we begin to try to break out, it stretches, but it will continue to exert influence, trying to revert back to its old form. That until a new paradigm is firmly established, will that old paradigm finally begin to relax its grip and then fade away. So we have to, when we recognize the need for new paradigms, we can't just make an effort, but we have to sustain that effort until we are convinced that that new paradigm is firmly established. It goes along the lines where we may recognize the mission, and we may not necessarily be reevaluating the mission, but we want to continually reevaluate the process, which brings us to another danger zone. And that's recognizing that our constituency, whether again, family, business, ministry, whatever, that what happens is that paradigm has subconsciously become the identity, that the process, they begin to subconsciously associate the process is the identity, that rather than the mission itself, they begin to identify with the process. And it's completely natural. But we need to recognize when, again, whatever our constituency is, when we recognize that for greater vision, greater mission, we need to begin to push out of that old paradigm, recognizing that subconsciously people associate with the process. And so we need to help them understand how the process needs to morph to be more successful, which also leads to internal advisors. And what I mean is this: there is wisdom in a multitude of counselors, absolutely. But we also need to recognize that are those counselors, those wise counselors that can be relied on, but are they unconsciously invested in the old paradigm? This is especially true with ministries that have traditions. They've done things a certain way for eons. And what happens is it's so difficult for them to be willing to risk breaking that mold of how they've done it to move forward. And so we need to recognize, as we do get input from those wise counselors, how tied are they, how invested are they in the old pattern, and helping them recognize that that may not necessarily be relevant going forward. With God, it's like manna. You know, when God was providing for His people, naturally, they started out wanting to try to store. They got some, they wanted to get extra and hang on to it. But manna went bad. God required them to come to Him for fresh provision on a regular basis. And it's the same with you and I, that He doesn't want us to rely on that old process, but to continually come to Him for new provision, new strategy, new ideas, new process. And that the old process, as successful as it was old manna. It was for that old season. Which leads to two of what I consider to be the most dangerous hindrances to forward progress. Now, the first is tradition. Now, don't get me wrong, traditions are great at holidays. Tradition should have nothing to do, I'm being very bold here, but tradition should have nothing to do with the process we use to implement the vision God is giving us. That just because it's the way it was done in the past, or worse, if the tradition is so ingrained it's the way our ancestors, our parents, our grandparents, for going back did it, then we absolutely are locked into an old paradigm. Again, traditions are great in the right context, but traditions should have nothing to do with the process and the paradigm of how we move forward in the vision God's giving us. And that leads to, finally, what may be the most dangerous itself, and that is security. And security comes in so many fashions. Financially, again, security of the process, security of what people are happy with. And security can be the thing that locks us in and makes us, limits us. It prevents us from being like Peter, who literally steps out of the boat and begins to walk on water. That we need to recognize that the old paradigms, the ways that worked in the past, probably aren't the way that will work going forward. And that for us to have that greater success, greater impact, greater vision, requires us to be willing to risk breaking many of the old molds. And as leaders, requires us to help others see the need to let go of old paradigms so that we can embrace what God is doing going forward, and in doing so, enjoy greater transformation.